Welcome to the Life Safety Podcast.
Thank you.
We got a couple. No problem. Got a couple special guests today, and I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
My name is Justin Dunn. I am the sales product specialist and trainer for Haws. And with me,
Jim Maglaris. I cover services for Haws, and we're going to talk about a lot of that with emergency shower eye wash equipment. So any questions that they have, please send them to us. Yeah.
Will do. So how long have you guys been in your respective roles? How long have you been involved in the advancement of eye wash and safety showers, the education of it, and just the service side of it?
Oh, sure. I've been with Haws for about 5 years now.
Okay.
I've been actually doing the training and education piece for Haws for about 3 years now. Running the podcasts and the webinars. I'm not brave enough to do it on camera, and then also the trade shows and things like that for 3 years now, and trying to get the message about emergency equipment, the importance of it, out to as many people as possible. So.
Retired Navy, have an engineering background, and then joined in Haws in the January of 2018, and immediately went to work and daily do emergency shower eye wash inspections and compliance for joint commissions and things like that into the healthcare. So it's been very beneficial to see compliance raised at client sites from start to finish.
Just kind of how Jim and I interact on a regular basis. I handle a free site survey program through Haws, and we end up going into the site and testing against ANSI standards and things like that, while Jim handles the back end of that and does a lot of the maintenance and correcting of emergency equipment, the actual physical adjustments and bringing sites into compliance, which is really cool.
Great, nice. All right, well, getting into the eye wash of things. Break it down and give us the one-on-one on eye wash. I know there's eye washes, there's eye face wash, there's safety showers. What standard governs that? Like, where does that come from? Is that OSHA? Is that ANSI Z350 358.1? Kind of give us a background on eye washes and safety showers.
Yeah, I can do that. So, and we've been doing that since about the 1950s. Back in the 1950s, at the time. We've been doing this since about 1906 total as a company. So we're about 114 years old as a company, but only got into the emergency equipment piece in the 1950s when it's actually kind of a funny story. A company, small company, probably never heard of them, Chevron, was buying hundreds.
Never heard of them.
Hundreds of drinking fountain bubblers.
Okay.
And basically creating their own eye washes using two drinking fountain bubbler heads, pointing them towards each other and trying to create an eye wash. And we were like, we can make those. So since about the 1950s, we got into the eye washes and safety showers and things like that. Back then, it was really not highly governed. It was highly suggested that you have emergency equipment on site. And unless it was like a really dangerous facility where there was a high exposure risk for corrosive chemicals and hazardous substances.
Like industrial plants and things of that nature, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. You didn't really see emergency equipment. It was pretty rare back then.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't actually get into the standardizing what was required until much later. And it's officially, it's OSHA that governs that we have to have safety equipment on site. They give us their standard, which is 29 CFR 1910.151C.
Okay.
But it's really just a paragraph that says, hey, if you've got hazardous substances, you have to have emergency equipment on site. What it doesn't tell us is how we're supposed to accomplish that, where they're supposed to go, how they're supposed to perform, and things like that. And that's where the ISCA came in. They wrote the standard Z358.1, and ANSI adopted that standard.
You said the ISCA?
Mm-hmm.
Who is that?
International Safety
Equipment Association.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And the ISCA wrote the standard. ANSI adopted it. And essentially OSHA just references that if we are to comply with their paragraph, with their standard, then we have to reference the ANSI standard.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And currently they're on revision 2014. Probably be a little while till we get another update to the standard.
Is there like a fixed interval when they, like, I know like safety code, there's like a 3-year cycle.
Yeah.
Before the 2014, it was what was it, 2009?
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of just varies, right? It could be 5 years, it could be
Absolutely
3 years.
Right. Yeah.
There's no set cycle revision when
Not
it comes
really.
to that standard.
It seems like every 5 to 8 years. So we're starting to push it with 2014, but Haws actually, our CEO president, sits on the board. And if you look right on the standard, it says Haws right on the first or second page there, along with several other equipment manufacturers of emergency equipment. And it seems like it's going to be a couple more years till we get any sort of full revision to the standard.
Any sneak peek on what some of those what criteria will be revised or added? Because most of the time they're adding stuff, right? It seems from the last couple of revisions.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest ones was tepid water in the last revision, which everybody's still bringing equipment in their facilities up to speed. We're still doing a lot of education on tempering for water and providing instantaneous heaters, skids that can do the whole site. And Jim and I, we can speculate all day as to what we would want.
Right,
we have a whole wish list of things we want on there.
Right.
But things like going, standardizing an eye face wash when you're talking about a shower, potentially rinsing the underside of your body when you're in a piece of emergency equipment. Because currently you got a shower, it's rinsing the top of you.
Right.
Eye face wash is covering your face and usually your neck, but nothing's covering the underside of you. So
Makes
eventually
sense.
Evolving equipment to adjust for that too.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. And so going back to ANSI Z358.1, so we're currently what's enforced? The 2014 version?
2014.
Okay. That's good to know. And so break down why is an eye wash important and a safety shower? And when is it required? And who dictates when it's required? Is that self-identified and implemented? Is it a fire marshal, AHJ? Is it OSHA who comes down? Is it the safety officer of a facility? Or is it a combination of all of the above?
Right. So, if OSHA visits, I mean, you're probably having a pretty bad day at your facility.
Right.
The answer is pretty a lot more obvious. It's usually staring people right in the face. It's amazing after we get done with certain events, how many people are asking us, like, well, how do I find out if I need an eye wash?
Right.
And what type do I need? And all of that information is right in the safety data sheet. It's all in the SDS sheets. So it's really important for the safety advocate, the safety manager, whoever that is on site, to reference the SDS sheets directly to get the answer. It's in the first aid section, and it'll say rinse eyes out for 15 minutes, rinse body off for, if skin contact, rinse for 15 minutes.
So it won't explicitly say you need to have an eye wash, but based on the interpretation that if it says 15 minutes, well, how else would you be able to do that, right?
Exactly.
Okay, got you. So that makes sense. I didn't realize that the SDS sheet would be the dictator and if you need an eye wash or not, based on whatever contents you have that would warrant that.
Absolutely. And depending on the severity of the corrosive chemical or whatever the substance is, it'll dictate, additional steps or even additional times for really highly corrosive chemicals. Sometimes the amount of flushing time that's dictated in the SDS sheet goes up to sometimes half hour, 45 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And that's typically that amount of time. And that's a long time
Right.
to sit in an eye wash or a safety shower. And really what that's doing is, one, ensuring that all the chemicals are off of the victim and then they're going to be safer for it. And two, that all of the substances are off of the victim so that emergency responders can also handle those people without actually hurting themselves and exposing themselves to whatever that substance is. So it's really important. And we've heard awful stories of coworkers having to force, or emergency responders having to force victims to have to stay in the equipment for the full amount of time to ensure that everything's rinsed off of them.
That they don't get contaminated or also injured.
Well, and a good point to that, what Justin's talking about is temperature. So the temperature requirements by ANSI are 60 to 100 degrees. So if you're asking someone to flush their body, for a full 15 minutes, it could be longer than that based upon the chemical from the manufacturer. That's a long time for, say, water temperature that may be 50 degrees that we check, coming out of the showers and the eye face wash heads. So those, and then in turn with that also would be when temperatures rise, right? So
Right.
I've been at sites where, say, piping wasn't insulated, direct sunlight, where we could record, 130 degrees coming out the eye wash heads. So it's very important those temperature requirements are met, and they're based upon what a person could be able to withstand, for that period of time.
Mm-hmm. And the current standard is 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything within that range would be considered compliant. But obviously on either end of the scale, it might force the victim out of the equipment too soon, either scalding the soft tissue of the eyes or freezing them out of the equipment.
Hypothermia.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's in an outdoor situation. You've got
Right.
wind, other things affecting
Other
you.
elements, definitely.
Yeah,
Mhm.
could make a bad situation even worse.
Okay. So, explain the difference between eye wash and eye face wash, because obviously everyone just either knows eye wash station or safety shower station. What is the difference between the obvious description of it? What's
Sure.
different?
So ideally, and if you visit a piece of emergency equipment, whether it's in a chemical facility or a hospital or a school or your favorite restaurant in the kitchen, wherever it happens to be, you're most likely to run into an eye wash. It's one of those pieces of equipment that's been in the industry the longest. But a lot of our education as a company and people that focus primarily on inspections of facilities and ANSI compliance is really that you have the most appropriate response for what it is that you're dealing with. And there are situations where an eye wash is perfectly fine. This is, typically what you'd find. You find a bullhorn type eye wash, 2 heads. You'll have 2 streams of water, 1 for each eye. And we'll get to that a little bit too. I'd love to talk about that and the message behind our Axion technology. But the eye wash is great for dust particulates. Think construction sites where you've just got dirt and dust and stuff flying up in the air, stuff that's not going to affect your skin and your neck and things like that are, and burn you or affect anything outside of the eyeball, and rinse those out, and then you're headed to the hospital afterwards.
Gotcha.
The eye face wash is intended to pretty much capture everything that an eye wash would be appropriate for, up to a combination unit with a shower, much more appropriate for those situations. Anytime we see an eye wash on a safety shower, we really try to educate and explain that if you've got a shower in place, the message almost immediately is full body decontamination, right?
Right.
It's focused on your entire body, which makes an eye wash with only 2 streams of water for your entire face just not ideal. If you're dealing with a chemical, it's probably going to be a splash hazard. It's going to spray, it's going to splash, it's going to get on your entire body. It's going to be unpredictable. The idea of something just landing 1 in each eye is kind of silly when you think about it, potential exposure. So this going with an eye face wash where you've got coverage for your forehead, for your cheeks, for your eyes, and your entire face is much more ideal.
Right.
So it's really...
Is the SDS going to
important.
specify that, or that's just more best practice? Or I guess that's the question is obviously it seems like that would be best practice because you're not just getting the eyes, but would that go back to the SDS sheet as far as what's required to be drenched or flushed out?
Sure. Yeah. And with that, there are assumptions that we can make with the SDS sheet. So again, if they call out just the flushing of the eyes, right, in the first aid section, eye wash is probably just fine.
Okay.
But if it's any sort of skin contact and eyes, a combination of that, then an eye face wash would be the most appropriate type of equipment. Because we're talking about your face, your eyes, and potentially your skin too. So you're worried about a shower But a lot of those assumptions with the eye face wash versus eye wash can be drawn from the SDS too.
Okay. And we'll probably get into it later, but I'd like to get into it right now.
Sure.
I remember when maybe a year or some months back, I was a facility manager, and Jim came out and was educating me on the way the eye wash sprays. And he was educating me on that, things can get into your nasal duct, into your eyes here, because the eye washes traditionally will flush the water inwards towards your nose area, I guess, the bridge of your nose, which then could get into your body. And I know that you're going to bring up the is it Axion?
Axion, yeah.
And one of the things that struck me when he said that was it flushes the opposite way, away from your nasal area. So can you kind of elaborate on that? And to me, it struck me because if that is the case, and most other models are the traditional way, which goes inward, why would that even be allowed? Well, why wouldn't that be something where I don't know, ANSI or OSHA would say, look, this almost like a recall. Like, look, we figured this out, and it actually does. While it may also, do its job, it could also induce some other issues. And so I was kind of struck by that, by it still just being something that's allowed.
Oh, sure. And that was industry standard forever. And somebody woke up one day with the brilliant idea over at Haws to go find out what the standard is for the medical community. How if you went to the hospital immediately after exposure, you got something in your eye, how would a doctor or a nurse flush your eye out? And what they would do is lie you on your side and flush from the inside out to make sure that all of the contaminants in your eye aren't getting flushed towards what's called the lacrimal puncta, which is the nasal cavity.
Okay.
Which is a potential entryway into your respiratory system, which could make a bad situation even worse. Yeah. So what Axion does, and we've had Axion since about 2008, and there's the really fluffy, cool side that we like to talk about with Axion, which is the medical superiority of the product, how it flushes the eyes correctly, and taking contaminants from the inside of your eye to the outside and removing those the correct way. And then there's a whole nother side to Axion with the flow controls and the things that we've included in this technology to help fix a lot of the performance issues that we see in emergency equipment. Emergency equipment's one of those pieces of equipment in your facility that a lot of people, you have to have one. It goes in the dark corner of your facility and they forget about it, or they don't test it, and it breaks down over time with lack of testing, and eventually develops performance issues, if not right off the bat, due to poor plumbing, too much pressure, too little pressure, and things like that. And with Axion, what we've developed is this pretty incredible system where we can retrofit about 80 to 90% of all emergency equipment that's out there and help create a lot of the really serious flow issues and things like that are out there. It's pretty incredible little tool. Yeah.
The other thing that it can do is if you had an eye wash, then it could convert it to an eye face wash. So, if you think about a splash, which Justin talked about earlier, only hitting this small portion of your eye, what's the chances of it only getting this small portion vice the whole, surface area of your face? So you're limiting your risk by having an eye face wash, and in the conversion or the retro kit that we provide, that would be included in it.
Okay, so not only can you retrofit and have a traditional eye wash actually spray what's the recommended nurse practice way, but in addition to that, you can convert it into a combination eye face wash.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is, say, this head here, the flow of water. These are the dust covers or the contamination dust covers that are in place would come off when the eye wash paddle is activated, and the water would be coming from the outside in, flowing this direction.
Right.
Now this head here with the tab pointed at 12 or 6, then the eyes are being flushed from the inside out of these two ports here. And this section of the head here that you see would cover the face itself. And it has an orifice control in it so that it's
regulating the
pressure of it, so
Nice.
It's not injurious. Yeah.
Which we run into constantly. I like to call them brainwashers. You get those eye washes you flip on and it's shooting like 20 feet this way,
Right.
20 feet that way. Nobody wants to stick their face on it. That's going to hurt really bad.
The other thing I want to point out while we're talking about this is if you have two heads here, a lot of times what you'll see when we do the inspections is that you may see one that's higher and the other side that's lower, right? So it's kind of an imbalance or a competition between the two sides, right? This design here is one flow, right? So
Right.
it doesn't have the imbalances between two. It's a single head that flows correctly
Opposite
out.
of each
Yeah.
other instead of
Yeah.
towards
Right.
each other.
Right.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Okay. And we're getting into the inspection criteria. So I know we got a weekly and an annual.
Yep.
Break that down for us.
Sure. Weekly activations are required in the ANSI standard, but the tests are sometimes not very frequently being done because it creates a mess, which is one of the reasons we end up retrofitting a lot. But all that has to be done it's very simple. So for plumbed emergency equipment, all you have to do is activate the equipment, ensure that you have water to the heads of the device, head or heads of the device. It has to be long enough to clear out the dead leg because there's Legionella concerns and you can get other growth in the pipe and things like that.
That's subjective criteria too, as far as the time to do that.
Sure.
What is the recommended? Is it a minute? Is it 30 seconds? Is it based on if it's a safety shower or eye wash?
Mhm.
How do you know how long to flush it out for?
That can be really hard to gauge. As a standard, if it can be done, I suggest leaving the equipment on for a minimum of about 30 seconds. There's nothing in black and white that's saying you have to do it for this long.
Right.
Only that activation has to occur and it has to be on long enough to flush out that dead leg. But we sometimes don't know how long that dead leg is.
Right.
So which makes the weekly activation so important. So even if on a weekly basis, we're only doing 10 seconds or whatever we can get away with, we're doing it on a weekly basis. So we're clearing out the dead leg gradually as we, continue to flush it out every
Right.
week. For unplumbed equipment, it's much more simple. All you have to do is look at the stored flushing fluid. It's got to be full per the manufacturer's suggested filling capacity for whatever the tank is, whether it's air charged or gravity fed. We have to make sure there's enough water in there, and that's pretty much
Pressure.
Yeah.
Some of them have pressure gauges,
Yep.
so meeting the manufacturer's pressure that's on there.
Yep, that's it.
And then obviously, if it is a portable unit
Yeah.
that we're talking about now, it needs to have some sort of Bactrostat or some sort of antibacterial solution put in there. The thing with the plumbed units, and I get this question a lot, is that the idea of the plumbed units is that we're flushing them weekly from the dead leg to remove some of those contaminants that are in the line, keeping the water circulated, right?
Right.
And then making sure that we have activation at the head, that we see water flow. But on the unplumbed units or the portable units, they just kind of like hang on the wall, right? So we don't want bacteria to form in something that we're not flowing, right? So then we need to make sure that there is flow there, but that water's not in that container becoming, with bacteria. So there is products that we have that we can add to that plumbed unit to make sure that it's safe.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And Legionella is such a hot topic now. It's important to talk about. A lot of people aren't thinking about on the other side of our business, just as important. Haws was founded on the invention of the drinking fountain, the modern day drinking fountain, and Legionella can touch both sides of our business. And so we do a lot of education around making sure that dead legs get cleared, that you get regular maintenance on the emergency equipment or drinking fountains,
Right.
and trying to combat the likelihood of Legionella in the pipes and stuff.
Flushing it out is one way to mitigate that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so is it safe to say that on the weekly, it's an inspection / testing performance? Because if you're just inspecting, to me, an inspection is just a visual, indicator, visual look, check. But if you're actually activating, now you're testing.
Yeah.
You're testing to make sure it's functional, right?
Absolutely.
But on the non-plumb systems, then you would obviously it's just be an inspection. You're not going to test anything because you would exhaust your supply there.
Exactly. Yeah. Even a couple seconds might deplete, a full 15-minute flush for the piece of equipment, causing some compliance issues. So even when we visit sites, we make sure to ask, is it okay if we flush the equipment? You'll have to maintain this immediately. Afterwards, it's going to create a maintenance ticket item. So as long as you're okay with that, we like to actually activate the equipment when we get the chance, just to ensure it's compliant for the flow rate, the height, and things like that. But it's just a visual inspection of the portable equipment, self-contained, but you got to actually turn on the plumb stuff.
And what about the safety shower? I know we've been focusing on eye wash stations. I think a misnomer out there in the eye wash world is that safety showers can be tested monthly in lieu of weekly. Can you dispel that rumor or that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and the weekly activation requirement extends to all emergency equipment, including the showers. Testing was previously a monthly requirement, pre-2009, actually.
Oh, okay.
So it's been a long time since we've had weekly activations in place for emergency equipment. And the shower is one of those pieces of equipment that most dread activating.
It's inconvenient for the end user.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And at a bare minimum, the thing has to pump out 20 gallons of water a minute,
Right.
which is a lot of water.
Where's the water go?
Capture. Yeah, exactly. Not to mention the spray pattern of that thing, capturing it, funneling it, it can be kind of a daunting task. So the shower, more than anything, typically gets skipped. They'll turn on the eye wash and be like, that's good to go, I'm out of here.
Right.
But the shower has to be activated too.
Okay.
We offer test kits to try to make that as easy as possible, and funnel that water, capture it. You don't have to actually activating the shower is going to clear out the dead leg a lot faster than the eye wash or the eye face wash.
Just due to the pressure that's coming out.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. At the eye face wash level, you're looking at 3 gallons per minute requirement for the eye face wash and 0.4 GPM for an eye wash. So it's going to take a little while longer. At 20 GPM activation on off, and you've got the dead leg cleared out pretty quick. And so long as you're using a test kit for a weekly basis type test, you're again just making sure that the unit is capable of turning on within 1 second. Water's at the heads of the device, and you can turn it right back off. And we have bucket shower sock kits that will help you do that and help prevent the mess and stuff. You just got to find a drain or a sink somewhere.
And sometimes, Ruben, sometimes we'll find that clients are really overburdened with their other activities that they have. So, they're not just dealing with the testing of the emergency shower equipment. They have many other responsibilities. And we have clients that are, bringing us in to do the weekly inspections for them as well as the annual inspections. And we can take care of that. And we have what's called a Haws best practice as well. So there's ANSI requirements for, say, flowing the water,
Which are just the minimum requirements.
Right. And then we go a step above that. When we're out there, we're looking for, missing signs. In some of the brands, they have micro type filters that are in there that can accumulate debris. We clean those out. There's strainers that are in the eye washes that need to be cleaned and tested to make sure that the flow is good. There's, buffers in some of them that need to be cleaned out, as well as obstruction in the shower heads. So we really make sure that at the end of the day, that if there's an actual accident, that this equipment is, going to be able to provide the appropriate first aid for the injured.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. A question I have as well, I've always had is, if you do have an event and there's chemicals being flushed out and washed out of someone's body, say it's a safety shower incident, where is that water supposed to go down the drain, just the public drain, or is that supposed to be pulled and then kind of contained into and put somewhere else? So what's the story on that? What's the installation best practice, or what's the standard on where the water should drain to if you have an event? Obviously, we're talking chemicals are being, flushed out? Where does that need to go? Where's it supposed to go?
So there's nothing in the ANSI standard that specifically calls out that you have to have a drain in place or anything like that. So drainage is really left to local codes,
Okay.
local plumbing code. You have to check whether you have the drain, and then specific to the chemical that you might be treating or might be exposed to, there are certain chemicals out there where you have much stricter rules for how to dispose of said substances.
Okay.
So containment systems, drains, and systems to capture that contaminated water and dispose of it correctly have to be put in place. But those are for really, extremely corrosive and hazardous substances that just can't hit city sewage systems.
Gotcha.
But nothing in the ANSI standard, nothing in black and white in there that says you have to have a drain. But maybe eventually, again, speaking back to potential changes in the standard,
Right.
eventually requiring a drain, requiring that you'd be amazed how often we find electrical outlets near emergency equipment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
With no GFCI?
yeah, no GFCA, it blows our minds. But things like that maybe eventually addressed in the ANSI standard.
Okay.
The other thing to point out is kind of on the same type of topic is, because the standards do change periodically. We already talked about monthly activation, which is now weekly activation. Some of those equipment may be in places that are hazardous, like near an electrical box,
Mm-hmm.
or they may be, just a shower where chemicals within the actual rooms have changed, or even, the actual task has changed. So we ask that, risk assessments be appropriately documented to make sure that, if they have a change, that industrial hygienists are coming in, certified people to look at those areas. But we can certainly look at the ANSI requirements, the 10-second rule or 55 feet for a lot of the hazards could be looked at, as well as, acids or corrosives, right there next by where the task is being accomplished. We can certainly recommend products that would be able to meet those first aid requirements.
Okay. And so just to summarize, on the weekly activation, we're looking for flow of water, obviously.
Yep.
I guess if it has any protective caps on the nozzles, you want to make sure that those are intact.
Yeah,
as well.
and that's just a general answer requirement. On the weekly activation,
Right.
Nothing actually says that you have to have the dust covers in place. Just water to the heads of the device. It's capable of activating within 1 second, and you're clearing the dead leg out. That is
And then no
really
obstructions, obviously to the
got to have obstructions. They have to have a clear path between the hazard, the piece of emergency equipment, and a lot of that comes down to the annual testing requirements.
right, which is
So-
a good segue. So we know
Yeah.
that there's a weekly activation, and then we have the annual, and the
Yes.
annual is a lot more detailed and what I would call more of a formal inspection testing.
Absolutely.
And can you break that down for the respective eye wash and safety shower?
Yeah, absolutely. So on an annual basis, every piece of emergency equipment has to be tested through the whole gamut. You have to ensure that it's within the 55 feet in 10 seconds of the emergency equipment. The eye wash, the safety shower, both combined have to be tested at the same time for simultaneous.
Oh, so if it's a combo unit, you
mhm.
have to activate them pretty much at the same time and see if they're capable of flowing the required gallons per minute.
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
we're testing the eye wash or the eye face wash, making sure. And for the eye wash and the eye face wash, ANSI gave us a drawing for an eye wash gauge. And I wish I'd brought one, I'd show you, but it's basically 2 eye circles. They're based on average human anthropometrics, so average human eye spacing. And to use the gauge, basically you'd place the gauge above the eye wash with it running. Anywhere under 8 inches from the head of the device, the gauge has to line up with the water. With the 2 eye circles, just making sure that it's going to hit both of your eyes. And that's kind of how we're measuring the water too,
So there's a minimum, but there's no
mhm.
maximum.
unfortunately.
Okay.
So there's a lot of minimums in the standard. There's not a lot of maximums.
Is there a regulated pressure?
Not a specific PSI. We've designed our equipment to work anywhere between 30 to 90 PSI to give it a lot of forgiveness. So no matter what, if it's in that range, it'll work perfectly.
I say that because it seems like regulating the pressure would also regulate how high it goes, right?
It does.
Or how low I was at that
Yep.
point as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
And unfortunately, a lot of emergency equipment is designed with the thought process of just pumping as much water out as possible to treat the victim. And that's where we get into instances where we have the injurious flow rates coming from the eye wash. The shower is a minimum of 20 GPM. So sometimes you get shower heads that are not restricted. There's no flow controls in them. And you get 30, 40 gallons per minute dumping out of a shower on top of you, where the outer insulation of your body might already be compromised, damaging you further, making for a really uncomfortable experience. And we would like to try to take victim comfort into mind as much as possible and teach that where we can.
All right. So while there's no maximum, it does say it can also be injurious.
Right.
And so based off of that, you have to kind of gauge how much pressure you're going to put.
Exactly.
After some point, it would become a problem.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So we're testing the eye wash, we're testing the eye face wash, we're using the eye wash gauge to determine that that it's going to meet that your eyes are being met. The dust covers have to be checked to make sure they're in place. Proper signage also has to be in place, ensuring that it's highly visible, it's easy to see from the hazard.
Okay. So the signage doesn't necessarily say it has to be ceiling mounted or wall mounted. It just has to be in a manner that is easily identifiable.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So signage in place, it has to be well lit, the area too. Just ensuring that when you're at the hazard and you're working and you have that potential for exposure or you get exposed, from where you're at, you can easily identify the emergency equipment and start moving in the right direction easily. I mean, it's likely that you already don't have very good use of your eyes.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. So is there some kind of best practice to kind of know your facility and kind of know how to get somewhere? Maybe even like a blindfolded, test where you can kind of feel your way to that eye wash station based on where your workstation's at. Mm-hmm. Would that be something that's more like a best practice in case you are by yourself and you do lose vision, maybe not 100%, but 80, 90%. And now you've got to navigate and get to this eye wash safety shower station to kind of flush it out. I mean, hopefully you got, some partners or help there, but I guess, what if you don't?
Well, speaking to a couple best practices there, one, to that last point would be if you are guiding somebody, give them verbal communication as to guiding them to the emergency equipment. Don't touch them. Okay. Otherwise, you might just contaminate yourself, making a bad situation even worse. As to the and then between that hazard and the emergency equipment, we want to make sure it's completely obstruction free. Yeah, got that clear path. We don't need to make an obstacle course for people trying to get to the emergency equipment, right? And with the lack of visual aid that you might have getting to the emergency equipment, we want the sign in place. We want it as highly lit as possible so that you can get there as fast as possible. Ideally, too, it's a 10-second or 55-foot rule for the distance to the emergency equipment, but as close as possible is ideal, as long as it's safe to do so. Right. If it's a hazard that's going to continue to damage people in the area and things like that, we have to remove it a little further away. But the more corrosive or more dangerous it is, the more we want it almost immediately adjacent to whatever that hazard is. Right. Yeah.
The other thing to add to that is also on the same level. You wouldn't want somebody, transiting upstairs, where they couldn't see. So, on the appropriate level where the task is. Sometimes we see containment areas around chemicals, mm-hmm. and we'll see the actual emergency equipment outside of the containment area. However, the actual task that's being performed is inside the containment area, right? So those are some things to look at as well, because that could potentially be a trip hazard.
Absolutely. And working my way back to your original point, training is actually in black and white in the ANSI standard. Employees have to be trained on the location of the emergency equipment in their area. And we suggest as a company, just as a best practice, quizzing the employee on, a semi-regular basis. Where's your nearest piece of emergency equipment? And if you're working in an area that's unfamiliar to you, maybe go bump test the emergency equipment real quick. Make sure you're familiar with it. Standard is a pull rod and a push flag for the eye wash, but some manufacturers have started to design other ways to activate emergency equipment.
Are there any drills required? I think of fire drills, and they kind of go through the motions. I mean, is a drill like a best practice to say, okay, I want you to simulate that you just had an exposure. What would you do? Just kind of help them get ready for that, would be emergency.
We've seen a lot of different ones from companies over the years where one company had goggles that they smeared like grease in to simulate like not being able to see very clearly, and asked them to guide them to the nearest piece of emergency equipment and things like that. Drills are a great best practice. All that's in the black and white is that the employee has to be trained on the location and how to use it, which is really important. But if you develop that inside your facility, we always see that as a really great sign of a healthy safety community inside of your building. That's a great sign to have that kind of test and drill in place, especially for the emergency equipment.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the annual, so you're checking temperature, you're checking flow.
Yep.
You're checking some of the initial design installation requirements,
Yes.
height wise. What else are you checking?
So with that, specifically that last point, there are a lot of additions to the ANSI standard that affected manufacturers as well. So we have to meet a certain criteria, and we can only make a piece of emergency. We can make the most ANSI compliant piece of emergency equipment you've ever seen in your entire life, but sometimes somebody will take it out of the box and they'll do something else entirely with it.
Right.
So we try to do our best to communicate that, but the pull rod can't be any higher than 69 inches on the unit. And that's to make sure that the shorter amongst us can always reach the pull rod, because we can assume that the taller amongst us can reach any height pull rod.
Right.
The shower head itself, the actual nozzle, the outlet for the water on the shower head has to be 82 to 96 inches from the surface floor of the user.
Now, these requirements, retro, active, meaning like, let's say these were built, we go into a safety shower application and it was built in 1985.
Yep.
And maybe it wasn't built to the newest ANSI standard. So are those held to the newest requirements? How does that work from a regulation standpoint? Or are they grandfathered in?
That's a great question. It gets brought up all the time. There's no grandfather clause in the ANSI standard. So whatever the most recent revision of the standard is what we have to be complying with.
Okay, got it.
I love that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And Ruben, just to add to that, a lot of times when we come out and do emergency shower eye wash equipment inspections, we provide a lot of this training to the staff. We can certainly come out if there's a new facility that's being built. I've seen equipment that had installation instructions that wasn't properly installed.
All right.
So, those types of things, they're plumbers and they have plumber codes. We want to make sure that they're installed according to the manufacturer's guidelines, and then also meeting the ANSI requirements.
Almost like basically commissioning these new installations, right? Because I'm sure there's a lack of that for folks with the knowledge to come in to a brand new facility, inspect the emergency equipment and say, look, this is all up to the latest ANSI standard.
Yeah.
Instead of catching it on the back end. And then now it's not warranty or it's not part of the, installation.
Yeah, it can save a lot of time.
Plumber or contractor's an ANSI subject matter expert.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So, just to give you an example, the push paddle for the eye wash, if it's not installed at the appropriate distance from the wall, can be impeded when they're trying to activate it. So we wouldn't want to see that paddle turn reverse where you would pull it to activate, which is not universal standards. Just simple things like that we can help with.
So there's some things that appear to be compliant, but when you actually activate them, you find out that they weren't
during the
installed
inspection.
correctly.
That's correct.
Speaking to exactly that, there are two other requirements in the standard that touch on that. One is very frequently, and I don't know somebody opens the box and then just dies, step one is throwing away the instructions. But so you get these instances where you have a combination unit and you've got the eye wash facing this way and the shower facing this way. And they assume they're for separate instances, right? If you hurt your eyes, you can go over here. You get something on your skin, you can go over here. But they have to be operated simultaneously for the same exact person. And then one other issue is simultaneous flow, which is probably the most prevalent and probably the most dangerous compliance issue that we run into. Where, speaking back to the GPMs for the shower, if you're not restricting the amount of water that's coming out of the unit, like Haws does with our own equipment, with Axion, our shower heads, our eye face washes, we're all about controlling that flow, using it as intelligently as we can. But if you're pumping out 30 plus GPM out of the shower head, what'll happen is it'll starve the eye wash. So if you're testing it even on a weekly basis, and you're hitting the eye wash and you're touching the shower and activating it, but you're not activating them together, you're not going to discover the issue with the simultaneous flow. Gotcha. So you'll have perfect eye wash height activation or eye face wash activation on the unit, but the second you turn on the shower, the high GPM requirements for the shower will starve out the rest of the equipment. And now you have to make a pretty terrible choice. Am I going to save my skin? Am I going to save my eyes?
And one thing to add to that is, maybe the client then he rushes to get a larger pump or, a booster pump, which can be very costly, right? Mm-hmm. And some of those scenarios that Justin pointed out with the simultaneous flow can be resolved by the Axion retro kit.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
With those flow controls.
Yep,
that's correct.
Nice. Yeah, simply retrofitting the equipment with this technology will almost
into compliance.
A lot of the time just bring it right back in. Restricting the water at the shower head and feeding it back down to the eye wash or eye face wash and bringing it back into compliance. Yeah, other than making those expensive decisions to upgrade the plumbing, they can just upgrade the equipment at the endpoint. Yeah.
And who's authorized to perform both the weekly activation inspection and the annual? With the annual being more detailed, obviously you probably would want someone like yourselves that's competent in this field. But that's the question that I've run into sometimes is who's qualified? What makes you qualified, and what does the standard say regarding that?
Sure. The easy answer is anybody can really dedicate themselves and educate themselves on the ANSI standard if they really wanted to. Realistically, the weekly activations, sometimes an overburdened maintenance staff and things like that can lead to a lot of issues on site. Oftentimes, it's just an employee that's going around on a weekly basis activating, all of their equipment on sites that have maybe 8 or 10, maybe 20 pieces of equipment. That can be pretty easy. But when you get into huge sites, hospitals, universities, chemical plants and things like that, where you have hundreds of pieces of equipment, it's much more difficult to accomplish. So on a smaller scale, it's easy for the safety administration to educate themselves, train a couple employees, and do some weekly activations. On the larger scales, it's much easier to reach out to, say, Haws. We have Haws services, guys like Jim who are out in these facilities doing the weekly testing for these companies. And on the annual basis, it's even more complicated, right?
Right. Definitely.
You have a lot you have to, exactly. Yeah. Right. You have a lot more you have to pay attention to, a lot more you have to educate yourself in. And it's a difficult test for a company to accomplish, especially in those higher quantity, higher yield emergency equipment where they have hundreds of eye washes, hundreds of safety showers. And sometimes it's just best left to companies like us that have that services a piece of their company and can help to, help you to accomplish compliance rather than rolling the dice trying to do it to yourself. And we're masters of trying to educate and bring that message to people and helping them to understand what's required. But some companies just they need that extra hand. The assistance.
I know you're asking the question, but Justin, could you go into a little bit about the actual percentage that we see when we go out and do inspections of the non-compliance issues that we see?
Before we get into that, though, going back to who's authorized, when it comes to the weeklies, in my opinion, I would say probably the annual should be left for someone more of an expert, and the weekly probably for the end user. But speaking of the end user, I know in some organizations they set up where the facilities maintenance folks will do the weekly in lieu of the end user. What is your opinion on who actually should do the weekly? You probably would agree, but shouldn't the end user be tasked with doing the weekly because ultimately they're the ones that would be having to use it in the event of emergency?
Sure. Yeah, and absolutely. And it would it's highly helpful to have their own staff trained in the ANSI standard, and have that healthy safety culture around emergency equipment where they have their own employees going out on a weekly basis, documenting testing, doing the testing themselves. But what we end up finding is that either one, it's that the testing isn't being done correctly, or there are issues and they're not reporting the issues, or there are other companies outside of your own facility that you can hire to do these testing, and we've come in and cleaned up behind them, finding out that they're not reporting any of the issues that they're finding, or they're just doing a quick visual inspection. The eyewash is still there, and they move on. Ideally, we'd like to see their own employees trained and doing these testings. We currently have a few on-site staff doing much larger facilities on a weekly basis. But it's the most important test. So ideally, it's their employees, but sometimes their maintenance staff, their own employees, are just too busy with other tasks inside of the facility, and emergency equipment is usually what suffers.
Right. And if some what would be deemed a severe deficiency doing either a weekly or an annual that you think would warrant like red bagging it and just shutting that eyewash station down, where it's actually unsafe and, to your point, injurious to even use it? Is there any specific failure that you would think that stands out? I kind of relate it to, I always go to the life safety side of like fire doors. Like, in my opinion, on a fire door, the most important feature is that it self-latches. There's all kind of other, criteria that needs to be checked.
Sure.
But coming from an eyewash safety shower perspective, what's one failure that if that's the failure, you want to immediately try to, correct these deficiencies. But what's one of those, like, all right, if it has this failure mode, we need to take it out of service until that portion's corrected?
Absolutely. So there are the tertiary type stuff, like, oh, it's missing a sign. The dust covers, broken and things like that. That's not a huge deal. Like, we can buy replacements. We can get that stuff fixed. Anytime we get to the performance issues for the emergency equipment, you've got an uneven flow rate coming out of the bullhorn style eyewashes. You've got the simultaneous flow issues and things like that. Usually that's time. And if you're self-aware and you've been educating yourself and you realize you have these issues inside of your facility, that's usually the time to get somebody like us involved, have us come inspect your facility and help you to get back up to compliance, so that when OSHA does pay you a visit, we can, make sure that you have a positive outcome on that.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now getting into, you can give me your top 5 or top 10 or whatever you think, but what are the top deficiencies you're finding when you're doing these inspections, weekly or annual? I guess annual would be where you kind of identify those deficiencies. What are the top deficiencies?
Sure. So not enough flow.
Okay.
Yep. Not enough water to the heads of the device. Uneven flow rates coming from older bullhorn style eyewashes and things like that. I usually get clogs in the line. One's this high and one's this high, and you got to choose which eye is your favorite.
That's a bad predicament.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The injurious flow rate, of course, coming out of the eyewash, the brainwashers, where it's just, you're never going to want to stick your the soft tissue of your eyes, and that it's going to hurt really badly. And you got to do it for up to 15 minutes. Just a horrible situation to be in. The simultaneous flow is the sneakiest one. That one's, in my own personal opinion, just the most dangerous. It's the most undiscovered issue with emergency equipment. You get that starvation. You usually don't find out until somebody actually needs the equipment for real. They turn both on, and you're in an awful situation. Can you think of another one?
Yeah, I mean, we see so many out there, but I mean, like you're saying, 5, you're hitting on those. You might see a pull rod that's missing,
Okay.
That would be really dangerous, Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The other thing that's common is, like a nut that's removed off the eyewash paddle, so that paddle could easily fall off and there not be any first aid available, for the eyes. And then I'll tell you this as well. The equipment may seem simplex in nature, but training tells us exactly what the person needs to do. So sometimes the new people that's maybe hired or into the company or just never worked around chemicals or any type of eyewash equipment, they may not know how to activate them, especially those wall recess units where the handle's not kind of like in the standard place that you would see a rod where it's an actual handle that's in the wall.
I've seen some of those. They're not as obvious of how to operate.
Right.
Those ones that are wall mounted.
So in labs, you see those a lot. And, if you had a chemical spill or, some type of exposure, you would need to know how to do that. And that's why the requirement says that those that are working in hazardous locations have appropriate training, and we offer that.
Yep.
Right.
Okay. And so what occupancies have the most eyewashes just traditionally? Is it schools, universities? Is it hospitals? Is it industrial plants? What are you guys seeing as far as having the most safety shower and eyewash equipment? Or it just varies?
It varies wildly.
Okay.
To some of those that you spoke to, like medical facilities, I mean, you have so many labs and potential for exposure to some hazardous substance there. So even just janitor closets, you've got bleach and other substances in there. It's important to have them. Universities have just a mountain of emergency equipment in them. Chemical facilities, wastewater, pulp and paper, they're everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah. It's more surprising in some of the areas you don't really think about that you should have emergency equipment that people don't, like restaurants, in a restaurant kitchen or something like that,
Right.
It's important to have them nearly everywhere.
Okay. Well, anything else you guys want to touch on before we wrap it up?
No, although so in the inspections that we do for through Haws, we go on site, we measure against the ANSI standard. We really try our best to offer as many services as possible to visit and correct emergency equipment, help people into compliance. Throughout all of those surveys that we've done, we found that on average, you have about a 1 in 5 chance of actually activating a piece of emergency equipment that will provide proper first aid.
So there's a 20% complete passing rate.
20% compliant.
Wow.
Yeah. 80% are non-compliant for performance-related issues. All those, the top 5 I mentioned earlier, we find those just everywhere.
That's pretty alarming.
It is pretty awful. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. And how can folks get a hold of you guys?
So www.hawsco, HAWSCO.com is our primary website. All of our product is on there. You can reach out to us directly. I'm at Justin D as in Delta at hawsco.com. And or you could reach out to Jim.
Jim, M.A. at Haws, HAWSCO.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
And I've watched several of your webinars, and I know they're available on YouTube, and they're very informative, and definitely appreciate that content.
And thanks for attending that. Yeah, those are really important to us.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so is there any upcoming webinars that y'all guys got on the horizon?
Yeah, and I wish I had the date. It's coming up in April. If you register through hawsco.com, I have an upcoming ADA accessibility webinar that I do. So I flip flop between ANSI, ADA, touch on both subjects.
And it's ADA as it relates to eye washes, or just totally ADA separately?
So ADA really kind of touches on all equipment in your facility. We try to focus more on the drinking fountain side of our business with the ADA, but it also applies to emergency equipment for those areas where you might have wheelchair access.
Okay, sounds interesting. I'll be on the lookout for that.
Thank you. Yeah, and then register through the website, and it's coming up in April.
All right. Well, thank you guys for coming out and being on the Life Safety Podcast.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right.